Hi everybody, welcome back to this afternoon's session. So we've got another session of very interesting science talks this afternoon. Alex Archibald, who is first on the agenda, unfortunately can't make it this afternoon. So we're going to forge ahead with the speakers after Alex. So apologies, everyone's kind of been shifted forward 12 minutes. Hope that's okay. If there is time at the end, Colin suggested that I pitch in with some of the UKCA 1.1 results that I kind of raced through yesterday. So we'll see how we go. So first off is Jeremy, who's going to talk about using UKESM 1 to model the climate response to the reductions in emissions during COVID-19 pandemic. Go fire away, Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Jane. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. This work was done with me and Steve and Yong Ming in the core group under the benevolent.
Is it just me, or
can you hear me?
Can anyone hear Jeremy?
Can you hear me? You should be able to hear me.
Yes, I can hear Jeremy.
I can hear Jeremy, yeah. I can hear him okay, yeah.
I think it's you, Jane.
Okay. It's just you. Well, I'll bash on. This work was done with me and Steve and Yong Ming last year under the incisive leadership of Chris Jones. And the background to this is that, as everybody in the whole world knows, the pandemic's caused reductions in travel and other activities, resulting in reductions in greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere. And we're not the first people to wonder whether or not these reductions will have any effect on the future climate of the Earth. And so what we've been doing is using UKSM to run climate simulations to find out an answer to that question. So that's what the talk's about. So we start with we need some scenario for measuring or for feeding into the simulations for what the size of these reductions in emissions have been, and these have come from other work determined either by a combination of bottom-up estimates, so details about what changes in activities in different sectors like transportation and industry, and also top-down analysis, changes in what we can actually see in the observations. So those reductions scenarios have been developed in that fashion, and they've been used to develop scenarios for beyond 2020, including the one that we're going to be spending most of our time talking about, called the 2-year blip. And the way in which this works is that emissions are reduced from what they were in over a 3-month period at the beginning of last year, by reasonably small levels, 5% for methane and CO2. They stay constant until January 2022, and then they return to the pre-2020 levels. So hence the 2-year blip in the amount of emissions. And we've used these scenarios to create forcings and a modeling protocol to run our simulations with. So the experiment protocol that we have, we need some sort of baseline so we can determine if there's been any change, and the scenario that we use is the SSP 245 scenario. The 2-year blip forcings get applied at the start of 2020, and the runs go up to 2050, and then we take the difference between what we see in 2-year blip from the baseline, it's SSP 245, and we can see what the effect is. The effect is likely to be small, and so the larger we can make the ensemble, the better. Now, originally, when we started this experiment, the SSP 245 ensemble only had 5 members in it. However, we had done 16 historical members, and so there were is possible to add 11 more members. So each of these historical members is a starting point for a future scenario. We're able to add 11 more members to SSP 245, bringing that ensemble up to 16 members. And because, as you know, UKSM1 runs in concentration and emission driven mode, I need to tell you that all of our runs are concentration driven in these experiments we're going to show you. So let's have a look at some results. So in all the plots that I'm going to show you, I'm focusing on the first 5 years of the experiment, so from 2020 to 2025. And here I'm showing you are results for global aerosol optical depth at 550 nanometers. So in all my plots here, the green values are the results from each of the variants from SSP245, so that's our baseline, and the blue lines are the results from the corresponding 2-year blip experiment. So we take the green line away from the blue line and we generate the difference. So you can see here there's a trend, and the aerosol optical depth is slightly increasing over the 5-year period. And if you take the difference between the green and the blue, you can see that there's a reduction, a significant reduction in the aerosol optical depth initially, which then becomes statistically insignificant as we go forward over a period of 5 years. So as the effect of that blip gets taken out. That's aerosol optical depth. This is downward shortwave radiation at the surface, and again we're going to take the green line away from the blue line to generate the difference. You can see that doesn't change very much over the course of the 5 years, and there's a small positive difference in terms of the amount of radiation reaching the surface, but it's not statistically significant when in terms of what the standard deviation in the ensemble of 16 members is telling us. So that starts at a small positive difference, and that goes down to close to 0. And finally, the thing that perhaps you're most interested in, what's happened to the temperature, is the global surface air temperature. Again, you can see the trend for this is to rise, of course, over the next 5 years. But if we calculate the difference between the 2-year blip and the baseline, what we see is a statistically insignificant difference in the temperature. Again, compared to the standard deviation in the ensemble that we've got. So let me summarize that for you. We see an initial reduction in the aerosol optical depth, which becomes insignificant after 2 years. We see a smaller increase in the amount of solar radiation reaching the surface, which again becomes insignificant after 2 years. And we see no significant change in surface air temperature. We can look at the way in which that's distributed in space. In fact, if we take the average over 2020-24, we see a slight increase over Russia and Antarctica, and a slight decrease over the Arctic. But these changes are very small, only 1/4 of a degree. So those are the results that we got, or a selection of the results we got by doing these experiments using UKSM1. But it would be good to see what would happen in a multi-model ensemble, and that's what we did when we took part in an experiment called COVID-MIP. So what we had there were 12 models, including UKSM1, running of the order of 300 simulations. There's quite a large MIP, multiple initial condition ensembles in the way in which I just showed you for UKSM1. And the headline result there is what we found for UKSM1 is consistent with other models. So let me show you what I mean by that. So at the top here, or rather, sorry, at the bottom, I'm showing you the result that we've already seen for UKSM1. This is the global aerosol optical depth. And at the top, I'm showing you the result for the multi-model ensemble in COVID-MIP. So UKSM1 is one of these lines in here. We've got 11 other models, and they're producing a qualitatively similar result to what we saw in UKSM1. Ditto for surface downwards shortwave radiation, qualitatively similar in the multi-model ensemble to what we saw in our own model, and ditto for the global surface air temperature.
Cheers.
So no great change. Thank you. So we got this initial focus on the short term. The full experiments go up to 2050, and other scenarios have been run besides the 2-year blip. So in my picture here, 2-year blip means going back to whatever it was that we had beforehand, but there are other ways in which we could come out of this, come out of the pandemic. We could have a fossil fueled rebound, so emissions actually increase, or we could have different variations on ways in which we could use a green stimulus to reduce CO2 emissions as we go along. All the results that we've got have been put up on ASGF and for some of the other models in COVID-MIP as well. So what we found was that the pandemic, although it had an impact on many aspects of human life on Earth, including health, economics, and society, gives us an unprecedented opportunity to study how the planet's climate responds to anthropogenic changes in its atmosphere. The early results, at least as far as the 2-year blip scenario, show no impact on global climate. We've got further analysis that's ongoing or has been proposed, such as fixed SST runs to quantify radiative forcing due to emission reductions, and some examination of local effects like changes in extremes or atmosphere circulation. There's other analysis of other scenarios that are going on. Those are the ones that we had, I showed in the previous slide, and there's been even some talk about possibly maybe 2 years wasn't long enough for what the effect of the pandemic was. Perhaps we should be looking at a 4-year blip. That's all I have to say. I'll just leave you with 2 places you can find out more information. We wrote this up in the well-known and justly famous UKSM newsletter that came out of the beginning of this year, and perhaps had at greater length the whole of the COVID-19 experiment. Initial results from that has been written up in geophysical research letters, that reference there. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Super, thanks, Jeremy. Perfectly on time, and apologies for cutting across you at the start. I lost my sound, but I'm back. So there is a couple of questions in the chat, so it might be good just to, firstly, I think there's it might be good to clarify in terms of what emissions are modified in the blip. As Colin mentions, you reduce NOx, CO2, methane. Can you clarify about aerosol emissions like SO2
as far as I know, there wasn't any changes to aerosol emissions, but Chris, who's as ever looking out for me saying something mistaken, could correct me. But as far as I know, it was greenhouse gas emissions that were the focus there.
No, I think we did do SO2 as well.
Oh, beg pardon. Sorry, there we are.
No,
Where would I be?
I think we took all of the emissions from Piers Forster's paper, which was kind of the inspiration for doing this. So that had SO2, NOx, VOCs, ammonia, which we don't. Not sure we do for that, but yeah, it had all the.
Yeah, because otherwise you wouldn't have seen that kind of initial reduction in the AOD, I don't think, without the SO2 signal in there.
Yeah, the AOD
right
comes from that.
Right. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks for that. Okay. Sorry for the wrong answer.
And again, Jeremy, this might be one more for Chris, and I think there's a little bit of discussion in the chat on it, but perhaps you can maybe just put your own perspective on Peter's question about would you expect the air quality to have improved due to the 3 to 5% reduction in the NOx?
Again, I really can't give a more authoritative response to that than what Chris has said there. I don't have anything to add really to his comment.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. They can have a chat in the chat about it. So we'll move on. Thanks a million, Jeremy.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, we'll move on to Anthony, who's going to tell us about implementation of a new nitrate scheme into the UKCA model and hopefully into UKESM. Over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Jane. Can you hear me? Am I okay?
I can hear you.
Excellent. Good. That's a good start. Okay. So hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about a new ammonium nitrate scheme, which we've recently put into UKCA mode, and some initial sensitivity tests that we performed.
Sorry, Anthony, we can see your presentation notes.
Oh, okay.
Not that many notes, but we can see.
It's funny, I can't see that.
Have you got 2 screens or something?
Yeah, so I've got, okay, shall I close this? Would that work? Okay, better?
Not yet.
You have to change the display settings, Anthony.
Okay. Okay, I'm not sure how to do that.
Okay, maybe.
End slideshow.
Yeah, if you show it in the PowerPoint and then maximize it, that might be better for now.
So we're seeing your presenter mode. So we're seeing it where you see the next slide as well.
Yeah.
So I think you need to open up your laptop screen again, and at the top it says display settings.
It's okay. I'll just go on with this one if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
It makes it easier. Okay, so I'll talk about a new ammonium nitrate scheme that we've introduced to UKCA mode and some initial sensitivity tests that we performed with it. So why is nitrate important? Well, sulfate concentrations in the atmosphere have declined since clean air regulation was introduced in the 60s to the 80s, whereas ammonium concentrations have held constant or increased. Sulfate and nitrate compete for ammonium in the atmosphere, and therefore a reduction in sulfate leads to an increase in nitrate. So nitrate's a really important aerosol. It contributes to urban air pollution, radiative forcing, cloud properties, and biosphere impacts. And it's a real issue not having it in UKSM. So it was quite important to try and look at including it. So it's quite difficult to model ammonium nitrate, and this is because the precursor gases, ammonia and nitric acid, condense at different speeds, depending on the acidity and the partial pressures of the gases. And therefore, if you take too long time steps, then this can lead to numerical instability. So there are alternative approaches that you can take to this sort of dynamical approach. You could assume that the gas particulate system reaches thermodynamic equilibrium instantaneously, or you could assume a combination of the dynamical and equilibrium approach. So there has been a nitrate model developed in Leeds, HIDIS 1.0, but it hasn't made this transition to UKCA mode. And so that's the impetus for this work, is to try and get a simple scheme into UKCA mode. So we've been looking at this equilibrium scheme, which was kindly offered to us by ECMWF. And it basically relates the equilibrium constant of the ammonium nitrate system to the temperature, the relative humidity, and the gases. It's been compared to more complex schemes like isoropia, and it's been found to compare really well. So this scheme has been on the trunk since UM 11.8. It's UKCA mode setup 10. There are two changes to rows if anyone wants to run it. UK flags added to control the emission of ammonium nitrate and coarse nitrate separately. This coarse nitrate is associated with sea salt and dust and is just in the accumulation and coarse modes, whereas the fine mode ammonium and nitrate are now emitted.
Sorry, Anthony, sorry for interrupting. It looks like
okay.
the slides aren't advancing for us. We're still stuck on your title slide. Maybe if you unshare and try and reshare, perhaps.
Yeah.
If not, then I can share the copy I've got.
It's crazy. I'm never using Zoom again.
It worked fine earlier.
Yes, it did, didn't it?
Yeah.
It's a bit temperamental. I'm having issues with it today too.
Okay. Okay, sharing the entire screen. And
yeah. There we go. We can see your slide with the title "An Equilibrium Nitrate Scheme in UKCA."
Okay,
it's not in It's not in presenter mode though. So
no, that's fine.
Pull it.
As long as you
do you want to try? Do you want to try putting it to full screen or? Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
See if that works.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, so fine mode ammonium and nitrate are only emitted into the Ike and accumulation modes, whereas the coarse nitrate is emitted into the accumulation and coarse modes. So the really novel thing about this model is that we limit the rate at which the ammonium nitrate reaches this thermodynamic equilibrium using a first order condensation theory. The important parameter in this formulation is the gaseous uptake coefficient, which is not particularly well constrained by the observations. We know that for soluble materials like sulfate aerosol, it can get up to about 0.3, whereas for black carbon and dust, it's about 0.001. So we've run simulations with a unified model at UM 11.7 with strat chemistry and in a climate configuration and perpetual year 2000 conditions to look at what the difference or the sensitivity of this scheme is to the uptake coefficient. We've also run a simulation in which we assume nitrate reaches equilibrium instantly, and we found in the analysis stage that this was very similar to using a fast uptake coefficient, so we decided not to look at that any further. Okay, so now I'm going to be presenting the results of these simulations. So these are the column burdens. You can see that the ammonium in the top row and nitrate in the middle row are primarily concentrated over these populated land regions, US, Europe, India, and China, but also the biomass burning regions of equatorial Africa, whereas the coarse mode nitrate is much more evenly spread out. But the really interesting thing about this result is that there is twice as much fine mode nitrate in fast than there is in slow. And this suggests that we have some degree of control over the ammonium nitrate concentrations by using this uptake coefficient as a tuning parameter. We've also compared our results, these burdens, with other models, including Aerocom, and it seems to compare really well. So that suggests that the model is doing something relatively right. So now looking at the surface concentrations, and it's a very similar response to the result to the column burdens, in that there is twice as much fine mode nitrate near the surface in fast than there is in slow. Both the fine mode nitrate and the coarse nitrate are confined to the lowest 1 kilometer of the atmosphere, whereas the ammonium is able to permeate much further higher into the atmosphere due to its association with sulfate. So now looking at the seasonal concentrations, and you can see over the US, which is figure E, and over North Europe and the Mediterranean, the concentrations peak in the summer and in the autumn. And this seems to be very well correlated with the ammonia gas emissions, and this suggests that ammonia is the limiting factor controlling ammonium nitrate concentrations in our model over lots of regions. You can also see that in the slow simulation, the coarse nitrate concentrations are of a similar magnitude to the fine mode nitrate, and this may be a way to determine which of the uptake coefficients is more appropriate. So it's really important to use surface observations to validate the ammonium and nitrate concentrations, because it's really our only wide measurement network that we have. So we've been using the US network, CastNet, to look and compare to the nitric acid, ammonium, and nitrate concentrations. You can see that nitric acid is biased slightly high in the East US, particularly in slow when compared to CastNet. Ammonium concentrations are slightly too high in fast and slightly too low in slow, but both are acceptable. I guess the big result is on the bottom right, where you can see that the fine mode nitrate concentrations are of a decent magnitude in slow and a factor of 2 or 3 too high in fast, but the spatial distribution, spatial correlation is better in the fast simulation. There does appear to be too much nitric acid in the baseline simulation, and this may be due to the underlying chemistry. So going to Europe, and the spatial correlations aren't quite as well good when looking at the EMAP observation network. There are the magnitudes of fine mode nitrate, or in fact total nitrate, are better in slow than they are in fast, but the poor spatial correlation may be due to our choice of perpetual year 2000 conditions in these simulations. Next, looking at the diurnal cycles, and we can see that the nitrate cycles are pretty similar to observations at this observation site in southeast Scotland, Auchincloth Moss. Nitrate peaks at night and in the early morning, and then reduces during the day when the atmosphere warms up. There's too much nitrate and ammonium in the summer, and this may link to issues with the ammonia gas emissions in CMEP6, and this has been found by other studies. There might be some diurnal emissions, some diurnal issues with the ammonia and nitric acid gases, but they've been fixed in AQUM, so we might try apply the same fixes. So now's the more important thing, is like, what's the impact of ammonium nitrate and coarse nitrate on the climate. And you can see that there is relatively small global mean AOD changes, minus 0.003 in slow and 0.005 in fast. And these are similar to sort of results to previous studies, but there are quite large regional changes, particularly in the ammonium nitrate regions, Europe, India, China, etc. The effective radiative forcing is minus 0.07 watts per square meter in slow and minus 0.19 watts per square meter in fast. But there are significant negative radiative forcings of up to minus 10 watts per square meter in India in fast. And this suggests that there might be impacts on the monsoon and on other climate phenomena.
2 minutes.
So, thank you. I might not need it. Basically, we found that this uptake coefficient is a really useful parameter for tuning the amount of ammonium nitrate concentrations in our simulations. Eventually, we want to use a volume-weighted uptake coefficient based on the aerosol composition, but this was just a simple sensitivity test. The next step is to start introducing nitrate to UKESM, and this Catherine Hardiker has picked up this and is repeating these simulations in UKESM 1.1 AMIP. And then we've been thinking about coupling with the land surface and with the ocean biogeochemistry, hopefully in time for UKESM 2, but we'll have to see how step 1 is progressing. In parallel, I'm working on high resolution simulations using this model over London. I'm funded by the Clean Air programme, and I'm working with Hamish Gordon, who's already got this model working over Colorado, which is the figure you see, and you can see some really beautiful features over the populated land regions. There's high ammonium nitrate concentrations near the surface, whereas over the Rockies it disappears entirely as ammonium nitrate dissociates. The other thing that might be interesting is to try and get glow-map mode aerosols into AQUM or its successor, and the addition of a nitrate scheme is going to be really important for that now. So this has been written up into a paper which is in ACPD, and I welcome any comments and questions.
Thanks, Anthony. Really nice summary there. Very quickly, Colin asks, why is the nitrate concentration a minimum during the summer monsoon season in South Asia? Is it all washed out by the rain?
So I think, yes, so it might be something to do with that. It's interesting with South Asia in that the ammonia gas emissions peak in the summer, so this correlation disappears. But actually, if you look at the minimum ammonia emissions in South Asia, it's about 0.6 teragrams of nitrate per month, which is greater than almost all of the other regions. So there is just this surplus of ammonia over South Asia. But I'm not entirely sure. It's probably something to do with the monsoon.
Super. In the interest of time, Anthony, we're going to have to move on. But Andrew, you has another question there in the chat, so
okay.
I'll let you
I'll
answer that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So people can put their questions in the chat, and Anthony can reply there. We shall move on now to James Keeble from Cambridge, who is going to talk to us about the recent improvements to the stratospheric ozone in UKESM 1. Great. We can see your slides, James, so over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, so I'm going to give a brief update on some work we've been doing kind of across kind of Cambridge, the Met Office and University of Leeds, kind of improving the representation of stratospheric ozone in a flavour of the UKESM1 model, which we hope to submit to the CCMI 2022 activity. And for those that don't know, CCMI 2022 is a kind of fairly limited set of simulations that have been requested as part of the next iteration of the ozone assessment. So the WMO ozone assessment that's published every 4 years, they like to have new simulations for, and the CCMI 2022 simulations are going to be those simulations. So this is work I've done. Luke is the real kind of lead on the kind of code development, but then the names listed here are people that have worked principally on the kind of stratospheric ozone component of this model. But then I should acknowledge as well that there's a big team of people across NCAS, across the Met Office and from Leeds who have helped get together this the CCMI 2022 simulations and all the ancillary files that are required for that. I'm going to move forward. Okay, so I was recently involved in a paper which evaluated total column ozone projections from the pre-industrial to the end of 2100s in CMIP6 models, and when we kind of aggregate together the models and make our CMIP6 multi-model means, we get figures that look like this on the left. So these are kind of regional total column ozone projections in the historical simulation up to 2014. And then under the different SSPs out into the future. And what we see is that despite all these scenarios kind of abiding by the restrictions of the Montreal Protocol and reductions in principally CFC11 and CFC12 emissions, but other halogenated ODSs as well, we see kind of projected ozone recovery in these scenarios. But the emissions of other greenhouse gases, principally CO2, methane and N2O, play a really important role in the timing of ozone recovery as defined as a return to some historic value, principally, usually the 1980 or 1960s values. But what we see really interesting in the SSPs for the first time is that under scenarios with very strong kind of air quality mitigation efforts, you get very large reductions in tropospheric ozone. And so the total column, so the thickness of all the overhead ozone in the SSP1 scenarios, so SSP 119 and 126, never recovers to its 1980 or 1960 historic value for the near global mean, 60 south to 60 north in the top left corner here, but also at lots of kind of latitude ranges. And so that's really interesting as an aside from the kind of main thing I'm going to talk about, but that's really interesting in kind of how we measure ozone recovery. And are these really these return dates to historic values a good metric? And we see this here on the figures on the right, the kind of zonal mean ozone mixing ratio. So stratospheric ozone is always increasing, chiefly in the kind of polar lower stratosphere, where the Antarctic ozone hole completely heals under all these scenarios. But in SSP 126, the kind of strong reductions in ozone mixing ratios in the troposphere counteract at many latitudes the increases in the stratosphere, and so you see the column never quite get back to where it was. Whereas in a scenario like SSP 585, very large increases in the stratosphere and increases in the troposphere both help push the recovery message. Okay, so that's what we see when we kind of make our multi-model means, but when we kind of look at the models separately, we see that these multi-model means hide a really large diversity in total column ozone. And what is kind of immediately obvious as well is that this kind of pink line here, the UKESM1 model, really is significantly higher than definitely the multi-model mean, but all other models submitted to CMIP6. And this has important then considerations, not just for the story of ozone depletion and recovery, but also potentially as well regional climate change, particularly kind of associated with the onset of polar ozone depletion. And we see here not only, so on the left we see the absolute column always higher than other models, but then on the right kind of we normalize the model values to kind of 1980-ish. We see that, an effect of this is that the UKESM1 model is modeling stronger ozone depletion than other CMIP6 models. And so we wanted to know, can we resolve these issues fairly quickly and get something together for CCMI 2022? So looking in more detail in kind of where this bias is, so we've got the UKSM zonal mean ozone on the left and the CMIP6 multi-model mean on the right. And we see that, ozone in the stratosphere is kind of biased high everywhere basically, but principally in this kind of middle atmosphere kind of section, and then also kind of a very large percentage bias in the UTLS and descending down into the tropical troposphere. But of course the ozone mixing ratio there is relatively small. So if you're thinking about this in the column kind of bias, we're perhaps more interested in these changes up here. So what did we do to kind of address this? And the answer is a series of very simple changes. So the new chemistry that we have ended up with is not a kind of wholesale change to the UKCA chemistry model. It's just a series of updates, really. So we've updated the kind of rate data that is used for the photolysis scheme and for the biomolecular reactions. And we've changed the treatment to how tracers are conserved at the top levels of the model. So these are really kind of like changing input files, changing 1 or 2 lines of code, so relatively minor changes. The biggest change is perhaps the change to heterogeneous chemistry, where we've expanded on the kind of fairly limited set of chlorine-only heterogeneous reactions that occur on polar stratospheric clouds and stratospheric aerosols, to now include not only bromine reactions as well, but kind of bromine-chlorine cross reactions as well. So kind of hopefully a better representation of kind of polar ozone is included there. And when we make these changes, which again are fairly modest, we get really quite strong reductions in ozone everywhere. So throughout much of the stratosphere, in the troposphere, and then when we look at this in a column, kind of relatively modest reductions in the tropics, and then larger reductions in the mid-latitudes and the polar regions. And that's consistent with the kind of changes we've made, particularly these heterogeneous ones. So these changes reduce column ozone, and that's good because that's the direction we want to go in. So now if I show this figure again, which is the kind of evolution of global mean total column ozone 1850 to 2014, so just the historic period. Each of these colours is a CMIP6 model. There are now more models, so the UKESM1 is this kind of purpley colour line, still very high. And then when we make the changes, we get what we're calling our CCMI 2022 configuration, which are this kind of, we've got 3 ensemble members, so this blue line. And now we see really good agreement with the CMIP6 multi-model mean between about 1980 and 2014, so over most of the kind of observed period. And that's good. But then perhaps evidence here that we see stronger depletion in the kind of 1960 to 1980 period than other CMIP6 models do. And that's
2 minutes.
Thank you, Hayden. That's not particularly concerning because so most of the models on this line are using prescribed ozone from CESM2 Wacom simulations, and there is evidence that that model is underrepresenting kind of the historic ozone depletion, particularly in the northern hemisphere. Okay, but then so the CMIP6 multi-model mean obviously isn't observations. I'm going to go one slide forwards. It's higher than the observations, which are shown here in the black triangles. But interestingly, when we nudge the model, and that's so to give it the kind of specified dynamics from observations, the column is reduced again and now sits almost perfectly on these observations, which here come from the NIWA Bodica scientific data set. And so kind of my interpretation of this is that, you know, the bias that remains in the column is not coming from the UKCA chemistry anymore, but is now coming from kind of biases in the temperature and the transport of the atmosphere. So that's our next kind of thing to chase down. But as I say, kind of gold standard in modeling, if you nudge a model, how does your chemistry look? We look really good now in terms of total column ozone compared to observations. Okay, and so these are my conclusions, and it's basically just what I said. The only thing I didn't mention is that there is this kind of perhaps stronger reduction in column ozone following Pinatubo than other models and observations suggest, and that's something we definitely want to explore going forwards. And I'll stop there.
Super, thanks, James. That was a really nice summary, and very interesting to see that nudge simulation added in there on your last slide. Can you give have you got any kind of concrete ideas in terms of the dynamics and the role of the dynamics in that remaining bias, where in terms of your next steps? Have you got any kind of initial thoughts on that?
Yes, but nothing really concrete. So I mean, it becomes very complex suddenly. So obviously, you know, the local temperature affects your kind of chemical rates, but a big thing I suspect is happening is the height of the tropopause. If you move that, you know, even quite slightly, you get kind of, if you move it up, you get more tropospheric air, which is kind of ozone poor, so your column goes down. And I think that's definitely something we want to start chasing down, because we see very different tropospheric column ozones were being nudged and free run in simulations.
Great. And Colin has asked a question twice, which means he really wants to know the answer to it. That means for your CCMI 2022 runs, he wants to know, can you base your configuration on UKESM 1.1 instead of UKESM 1?
Probably not realistically, because we've already run our bases and started to upload that, and that was with the same configuration that was used for AirChemMIP. So. But definitely in the future, what we want to do is get these changes into the trunk and kind of rejoin the kind of UKESM1 kind of advances. So definitely, hopefully, we'll do that in the future. But I suspect the CCMI 2022 runs are due in August, so it's already kind of hell for leather to get it all finished.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks very much, James. We'll move on. Peter has asked an interesting question in the chat as well, so I'll let you have a look at that on the side. But in the interest of time now, we'll move on to our next speaker, which is Ranjini, who's going to tell us about the physical climate changes at global warming thresholds in UKESM 1.
Thanks,
Great,
Jane.
Ranjini.
Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Great,
we can
thanks.
see your screen, so over to you.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about some results from our analysis on UKESM 1 scenario MIP projections. This was done with through the lens of looking at future changes in climate through the lens of global warming levels or global warming thresholds, and also with the thinking about how these changes or what changes would significantly impact society and human life. This is work done with colleagues in the UKESM core group and at the University of Reading. This is also the first in a series of planned projects or papers where we plan to look at more in more detail at future changes in the Earth system under different scenarios to look at the impacts on society and potentially even at feedbacks, as was discussed in breakout groups B and D yesterday, and as Phil talked about this morning. So I'm just going to get started. Some of our initial results on this work were actually presented by Rob Parker, a collaborator on this work, last year at the UKESM GA. So I'm going to give some more recent results, but I'm also going to kind of give a very brief overview on what we thought of while, when we started on this project. So we wanted to look at global warming threshold exceedances in CMIP6 models. So when different climate models under different scenarios, or they're called SSPs now, the shared socioeconomic pathways, when they exceed 2 degrees and 3 degrees and 4 degrees and so on. We also wanted to look at changes in temperature, and that was part of our early results from last year. And we also wanted literally in the future work thing in Rob's talk last year, we had these things, these other things here, which is basically the significance of that warming signal and what these changes are like in other variables such as precipitation, soil moisture and stuff. So I'm just going to press on with this now. So this is an illustration of different exceedance years for different temperature thresholds. So on the y-axis are the temperature thresholds, or 1.5, 3, 4, and 5. That's basically changes when compared to the 1850 to 1900 means. And on the right axis, on the x-axis are the years of exceedance. So some things that I've kind of listed here as points of interest is that we considered 18 models that were fairly representative of CMIP6 models. All 18 models except one basically exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century. Under SSP 1 2.6, 7 out of 18 models do not exceed 2 degrees by 2100, which was kind of expected because the experiment was designed to keep the multi-model mean under 2 degrees Celsius if possible. UKESM mean exceedance years almost always occur before the CMIP6 median, and that is also kind of related to the to UKESM1 being on the higher end of climate sensitivity among CMIP6 models. Significance of the warming signal. So the top picture here kind of shows the absolute change in temperature at 2 degree warming. for SSP 3.7.0. And we kind of see that the Arctic regions have a, show like quite a bit of warming there, especially in DJF in the Arctic winter. However, when we also wanted to look at how significant this was when compared to internal variability. So when this is expressed as a fraction of the standard deviation from the PI control runs, we basically found that the tropics, while they show relatively small absolute warming, they do show quite a substantial warming when we compare it to internal variability. What this means is that this forced signal on top of natural variability in the future could exacerbate extremes, and it's particularly relevant because a large percentage of human population lives in the tropics. We also looked at changes in the water cycle. Specifically, we looked at changes in precipitation, P-E, and soil moisture. I've just highlighted a few things over here from results from seasonal June, July, August changes. So on the left column, are 2 degree changes at 2 degrees Celsius, and on the right are changes at 4 degrees Celsius. So these black circles are basically areas of increased rainfall. So the Indian monsoons are expected to get, will get heavier. And the Sahel region will see more rain as well. We also see drying in Europe and the Mediterranean regions, decreased, which is also decreased soil moisture here in the what's called the Atlantic forest, and then in parts of South Africa. And these have implications, as we know, more intense Indian monsoons mean you have to have you have to plan for flooding and damage to life and property and crops in the future. And in Europe, for example, like heat waves, as we've already seen in recent history, can have a devastating effect. So all these things kind of tie in terms of like being of significant impact to people living in these regions. And we also saw that there was a decrease in precipitation and soil moisture in the Amazon in DJF. I haven't been able to show DJF as well over here, but that again can have consequences, as we saw in Chantal's talk earlier, where there's increased chances of fires and more the forests getting depleted. We also noticed that changes at 4C are almost always amplified when compared to 2C, and almost being a double the change we see at 2C. So that's kind of motivation for us to kind of keep it at 2C and try, put in mitigation in place to prevent going to 4C. This is some analysis we did with polar warming. On the left-hand side is sea ice change at the minimal sea ice period in the Arctic and the Antarctic, respectively. And also on this axis here, the red line on the right-hand side here is the summer polar temperature. And this right plot here is basically the sea ice change at the maximum sea ice period. So so that would be like February, March, April for the Arctic, for example, and the winter temperature. So the circles are Arctic data and the triangles are Antarctic. The red is temperature and the blue is sea ice. And what I'd kind of like to capture here is that Arctic sea ice loss in the summer, or the minimal sea ice period, so which is kind of like August, September, October. At 3 degree warming, it almost is at 100% depletion. So it basically decreases by about 100%. And at 3 degrees, we see that Arctic warming, the change in temperature in the Arctic is up to 4 times. So these gray lines kind of give you an indication of, whether it's a factor of 1, 2, or 3, or 4 compared to the global mean. So it's a factor of almost 4 times as much as the global mean change in temperature. We do see something similar in the Antarctic, but not to that extent. But that also has other reasons because, the Antarctic has sea ice surrounding a landmass and so on. So this is just an illustration of the kind of changes.
2 minutes.
Yeah, almost done. So immediate future work planned on these lines is to focus on certain sensitive regions, some of the regions that we picked out earlier, like the Mediterranean and the Amazon and Australia and stuff. So this is kind of mentioned again as part of the plans for Rob's paper. So Rob Parker will be taking the lead on this. We're also going to lead Mora, another UKESM core group member, has already started working along with others on changes in the carbon cycle. So we would like to look at covariability of changes and impacts across the coupled system. And we'd also like to expand this to CMIP6 multi-model ensembles to kind of get a more comprehensive picture of what these changes might imply. That's it from me. Thank you.
Super, thanks Ranjini. Really nice to see all that work come together actually, and particularly fascinated by that Arctic amplification there. Very nice. There's only one comment, it's more of a comment on the question really from Colin in the chat. So you might, so maybe you can comment on it if you like. Maybe a follow-up is to look at the changes in the intraseasonal variability, for example, like daily rainfall over the South Asian monsoon at different global warming thresholds.
Okay, I'll make a note of that, Colin. Thank you.
Super.
If that's it,
yep.
shall I stop sharing? Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Ranjini.
Thanks,
that's great. And we'll move on now to Chelsey Baker, who will speak to us on the carbon sequestration pathways and efficiency in the North Atlantic Ocean. So we can see your slides, Chelsey. That's looking good. So over to you.
That's great. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about carbon sequestration pathways and efficiency in the North Atlantic Ocean. So we know the ocean is an important carbon sink, and this occurs via two main pumps, so the solubility pump and the biological carbon pump, which is the one that I'm going to focus on today. And so the pump transfers organic matter that is produced by phytoplankton through the ocean to the deep ocean. And as these sinking particles which contain this organic matter sink, a large proportion of this carbon is remineralized back into dissolved inorganic carbon. And so I'm focusing on the North Atlantic because it's a key region for carbon sequestration. So that's for two main reasons. One is that it's an area of deep water formation, so it's kind of the start of the deep ocean conveyor. And secondly, because it has one of the largest spring blooms in the ocean, and this leads to subsequent carbon export via the biological carbon pump. So researchers often try and estimate the magnitude of carbon that is stored in the deep ocean on these kind of climate relevant timescales. And so that's often thought of as longer than 100 years by the IPCC, and often something called carbon sequestration horizons are used to do this. And so effectively, this can be a depth horizon. So for example, 500 meters, by which once carbon sinks below that depth, it's assumed to be stored on these long time scales. And previous literature carbon sequestration horizons have been 500 meters, 1,000 meters, or the depth of the permanent picnic lines. That's a density driven horizon. And so the aims of the study that I'm presenting to you today were to identify efficient regions of carbon storage in the North Atlantic and explore how fixed sequestration horizons impact carbon storage estimates. So to do this, we have carried out Lagrangian particle simulations. So this is using a package called Ocean Parcels, and this package was used jointly with a 1/4 degree resolution configuration of the coupled physics biogeochemistry ocean model used within UKESM 1. And so basically what this package does is it releases a large number of particles at, so we chose depths of 500 meters, 1,000 meters and 2,000 meters to follow these sequestration horizons. And these particles represent this remineralized exported carbon that I talked about on the previous slide. And so we release these particles every month for 20 years and tracked them for 100 years. And so on the right here, you can see an example of particles that were released at 1,000 meters. And these are the trajectories of the particles. So this is just a subset of the particles so these are the black dots. And then you can see the pathways and how they evolved through time from the start of the experiment. And so you can see that most stay within the North Atlantic, but some do escape, for example, through the South Atlantic and into the Southern Ocean. And so as we're interested in the sequestration of these particles, we've used a mixed layer depth criterion. So in most places, the mixed layer depth has a seasonal cycle in which it's deepest in winter and it shoals in spring. Once carbon enters the mixed layer, we assume that it will come back into contact with the atmosphere in less than 1 year. And so I'm just going to show you a quick demonstration of how this works. So here we have particles released at 500 meters, 1000 meters and 2000 meters. And these are the imaginary trajectories, and this is the mixed layer depth. And then at every time step along the trajectory, the particle depth and the mixed layer depth are evaluated. And then if the particle depth is shallower than the mixed layer depth, then we say that the particle has been re-entrained into the mixed layer and has not remained sequestered during the experiment. And so, as you can see, we've stopped tracking the particle at 500 meters. So that was a very brief summary of the method. So briefly to go on to some results. So pulling in all of this particle and trajectory data, we can come up with these spatial plots, and we can look at how long it was until particles were re-entrained into the mixed layer, but also the location in which they were re-entrained. So just to orientate you to this figure, these are particles that were released at 500 meters, 1000 meters and 2000 meters. The colour scheme is the timing of particle re-entrainment, so it's a median per grid cell. And on the top panel is the release location of the particles, and then on the bottom panel, the data is plotted by the re-entrainment location of the particles. And so we can see several things here. That firstly, there's a clear spatial pattern within the North Atlantic. So particles are re-entrained into the mixed layer on shorter timescales in the subpolar North Atlantic. And as you move through to deeper release depths, so from 500 to 2000, the time until re-entrainment increases. And you can see actually in some regions at 2000 meters, no particles were re-entrained into the mixed layer at all. And so the timescales for re-entrainment kind of increase as you move further south as well. And then if we look at the re-entrainment location, you can see again that, so there's this region here, which is the Labrador Sea, sticks out again as being a place where particles are re-entrained quite quickly. And this is because there's very deep mixed layers in the Labrador Sea. And also you can see this in the Greenland, Iceland and Norwegian seas as well. And so some other features that you can see that particles tend to be re-entrained in areas where there's some upwelling, so such as along the African coast and also in the Southern Ocean as well. And the final point is that you can see there's much fewer particles as you move to the deeper particle releases, which is what we would expect. So then what we can do is we can again pull in all this information and calculate a sequestration efficiency of the particles that we released. And what you can see here again, so it's again plotted by release location for the 3 depths, is that sequestration efficiency varies regionally. So there's some spatial pattern here. And that again, the Labrador Sea and the Gin Seas have much lower efficiencies due to these deep mixed layers. And again, as you see, the sequestration efficiency is much higher, reaches these depths. So here is the Medusa carbon flux, organic carbon flux at the 3 depths, and you can see that this decreases as you go deeper in the water column. And so the reason it's important to consider the region is that, for example, here we have very high sequestration efficiency, but very, very low carbon that actually reaches the deep ocean. So there's not going to be much carbon storage in such a region. And then to take this one step further, and what I've done here is I've taken these carbon fluxes and normalized them to the highest flux at each depth. And so you can see the spatial pattern for these 3 is quite similar. And I've used this to calculate something I've called the carbon sequestration potential. So this is just the particle sequestration efficiency that I showed you on the previous slide, times by this normalized carbon flux. And so essentially what I'm doing here is I'm scaling the carbon fluxes with the sequestration efficiency to see what could actually be stored at each of these depths. And so even though the fluxes are much higher at 500 meters, the potential for sequestration is much lower due to the lower efficiencies, whereas by 2000 meters, you can see this plot pretty much mirrors the normalized carbon fluxes, and that the sequestration efficiency is quite high, and so you have a higher potential for carbon storage.
2 minutes.
Oh, thank you. And so to take this again just one more step further, what I've done here is I've calculated the carbon storage magnitude in petagrams of carbon per year for each of these 3 depths, so using these spatial maps you saw previously. So this is just the absolute magnitude of the carbon storage from Medusa at these depths. And then what I've done is, using this gridded sequestration efficiency, I've accounted for this and basically scaled back the carbon storage estimates. And then you can see that they're actually much lower. And so the point here is that actually using these shallow and also these fixed carbon sequestration horizons can overestimate the carbon sequestration magnitude.
I think we've lost you a bit, Chelsey, if you're still there.
Just to let you know, you're not alone, I'm still here.
It's a job to know, isn't it?
I think sometimes Chelsey has problems with her mic. It might be that. Chelsey, if you can hear us.
I should be here.
Oh.
Looks like she's just left.
Yeah, I think she might be blind. She's not.
That's a shame.
Anymore.
Okay, well, we can maybe come back to Chelsey if she can rejoin us. She's obviously had a connectivity issue. It's nice to know it's not just me that has connectivity issues. So that's a shame, because that was a really nice talk, actually. So given that she's not come back rapidly on time, we'll move on and we can come back if people have questions for Chelsey, or let her finish off her last couple of slides at the end. Does that sound reasonable, Hazel?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move on to Adrian. Adrian Martin, who's going to talk to us about linking a global benthic ecosystem model to UKESM 1. So hopefully, Adrian, you're there.
Yep, I'm here. Let me just share.
Great.
Can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect. Over to you.
Right, so we're literally plumbing the depths on this talk now. We're going to the ecosystem lurking at the bottom of UKSM, or at present doesn't lurk at the bottom of UKSM because we've been plugging a new one into it. And this is very preliminary. It won't take long, but hopefully just give you a flavour of what we've been doing. So first of all, you know, the obvious question, why do we care about what lives on the sea floor? One answer to that is that they are the gatekeepers, really, for carbon trying to get into the sediment for storage on longer timescales. And so these 2 figures here, these 2 delightful looking creatures, the one on the left is a burrowing creature. And we know already that burrowing creatures can play a key role in accelerating the transport of material from the surface deeper into the sediment. So that way of accelerating sequestration into the sediment. And then the organism on the right is the sea cucumber, which is a very effective hoover for any organic material that arrives on the sea floor. And so that plays a slightly different role in that it's actually consuming anything that comes down to the sea floor. And so, you know, the combined action of those is a major constraint on how much carbon is actually stored in the sediment on long timescales. Another reason that we might care is that the benthic organisms, whether you like the thought or not, are targeted by fisheries. And so, you know, for example, if you enjoy tucking into a scampi and chips lunch at your local pub, now that they're reopened, the scampi, the nephrops are essentially dragged out of the sediment in the Celtic Sea for the most part for us. And there are a number of other benthic organisms which are actively targeted by fisheries. Another one, I guess the wider perspective, is that they are a globally connected ecosystem, in the sense that, you know, the continuation, sort of the continuous nature of the ocean means that we have this benthic ecosystem which goes from depths of, you know, the order of 10,000 meters right up to the surface and spans the earth. And it is one which is coming under increasing pressure. So the rather anodyne picture there actually is a artist's impression of deep sea mining. And so this large combine harvester type thing is, without any damage to the environment, neatly picking up these manganese nodules from the seafloor. Obviously, it's not quite like that. And one of the other things that we need to be considering is, you know, what is the impact of that on the benthic ecosystem? Particular, you know, what is the relative impact on the benthic ecosystem compared to, for example, the changes that it will be experienced under climate change? And so it's that last point that I'll come on to now. There has been work done on this previously. The model I'm going to describe was first developed at NOC a number of years ago now. Andrew Yool, who'll be talking after this on a different topic, has already done some work using Nemo Medusa, not UK Earth System model configured, to look at how the total biomass, that's the total weight of these benthic organisms, changes out to 2100. He forced that using ICP 8.5, and this is showing you the change in the total biomass over that period. And you can see that there are significant changes. One of the reasons, well, the main reason, is that everything that lives on the seafloor is dependent on material that sinks out from the surface. And so all the way from anything that can influence primary production in the surface of the ocean through to anything that can intercept that material as it sinks down, convert it into other things, impacts what happens on the seafloor. So some of the limitations associated with that work, you know, it was a good first attempt at understanding what the first order changes are. It only covered a restricted range of organisms for technical reasons at the time. It didn't take into account changes in temperature, and something we've subsequently realized is, you know, something we hadn't realized at the time, that the mortality of the organisms was dependent on the availability of food, whereas the data that we've seen now suggests it's more temperature dependent. So that's another reason to include temperature effects. So the new model, Boris version 2, that's benthic organisms resolved in size, which just happens to coincide with the name of the person who first developed the model at NOC. We've now extended this model so that the schematic shows the basic structure. We have particulate organic carbon, essentially organic material, dead stuff, sinking out of the surface, landing on the seafloor, and there is a range of organisms all the way from bacteria to fish which consume that sedimenting material. So the model now captures all of those, you know, 18 orders of magnitude inside. The way that it does that, without having to have a huge number of variables, is that it makes use of observations suggesting that the physiological rates of these organisms scale with body size. So things like ingestion, respiration, and even mortality, there's good evidence suggesting that they have a strong relationship with body size. And so we have made use of that. We've also made use of a way of incorporating the effects of temperature to produce a new model which captures all of the organisms on the seafloor. Once again, it's forced using this particulate organic carbon flux arriving. And that's where UKESM 1 comes in, because what we've done as the first step is to force our model using UKESM. So first I'll show you how the model behaves. Obviously, one of the challenges of using a model that reproduces such a wide range of organisms is that you need to be able to look at how it reproduces those. Luckily, there are a few sites in the ocean where people have collected information on biomass covering a wide range of sizes. So I've just put 5 here. You can read the locations. If you want to know specifically where they are, I can tell you later. The thing to flag is that the 5 sites cover a wide range of depths. We have everything from 153 meters to almost 5 kilometers. And bearing in mind it's the seafloor, quite a range in temperatures. We go from about 13 degrees to -1 degree. So what you're seeing in the plots is a log-log plot of biomass versus the size of an organism. So these are essentially the distribution of biomass against size. And you can see that for the most part, the model, which is the red line, actually gives a good fit to the observations that we have. And so this is using a single parameter set. So the model that we have is globally applicable, at least based on the fact that it can capture the dynamics of these 5 rather contrasting sites. So this is a plot that I literally did yesterday, and there are some issues which, you know, there are no prizes for spotting, which I need to look into. But this is really just a first take on using the output from UKESM. So this is using the POC flux at the seafloor to force this benthic model and to look, first of all, at the spatial variability that you get in the biomass. So that's in the top left. That's showing the biomass for the historical run, 1990 to 1999. So you can see the strong gradients that you'd expect with the subpolar and tropical regions, where you tend to have more POC flux, slightly having the greater biomass. But then we have comparisons to various other runs. So in the top right, this is now the historical versus the pre-industrial control. And so you can see that though there are some regions where the biomass has increased a little, the overall trend is that it's blue, showing that there's been a decrease in the biomass in the historical versus the pre-industrial.
2 minutes.
Thank you. In the bottom left, in the bottom, we now have a comparison to 2 SSPs, 126 and 585, sort of the good and the bad, as it were. And you can see that in both of them, there is a significant decrease. And in particular, in the 585, there is a very widespread decrease in biomass. This is a percentage change. So you're talking very large percentage changes in the biomass out to 2100. So just in terms of what comes next, we have got all of the organisms we want in there. So no excuse to put anything even bigger in. What we do want to do is to look at other CNIP6 models, you know, essentially to build up some uncertainties in our predictions, and also to look at the rate of transient, how quickly the ecosystem can respond to change. Then step 2 is wondering about how we couple it fully to the UK Earth system model, whether we then use it as a way of having a feedback of carbon either into the seawater above or as a permanent sequestration into the seafloor. And obviously we can think about other things like habitat, oxygen or burial. But I think that's enough for now, so I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. There are a question from Colin in the chat for you and Andrew. Andrew's given a stab at it in the chat, but maybe you'd like to add your own views. And so Colin was asking what happens to the biomass in UKESM 1 at the moment when it reaches the sea floor, and what do you envisage in terms of plans for this benthic model? Is it a possibility for being included in Medusa in UKESM 2?
So I'm happy to answer the second bit, and I think Andrew is the best person to answer the first one. So for the second bit, we very much would like to explore whether we can use this as essentially an upgrade for what happens in UKESM at present. So, you know, I don't want to go into any more details yet, because I think it depends on, you know, the analysis of how it's performing at present. But maybe I can hand over to Andrew now for him to tell you what happens at present in UKESM 1.
I think I've answered that in the chat already, but at the moment we just have a big bucket at the bottom of the ocean which stuff falls into and then slowly dissolves out of. And this would kind of replace the bucket with something which is more dynamic, I guess, rather than what we've got. As I say, at this moment, it's just a very, very simple scheme. And this would also be a relatively inexpensive scheme, because it's essentially a relatively small number of coupled ODEs. So it's not particularly expensive. It has no spatial component other than just being a 2-dimensional flat surface.
The thing I can add to that is that, you know, if we want to save time, there is actually an analytical solution for this model. So it's possible to actually do it even lower computationally demanding by just solving it instantly, provided you make a certain few assumptions about the timescale in which you're interested.
Sounds intriguing. Yeah, that sounds very good. Evgeny asked a question. The large change happens in the polar areas. I presume he's referring to your second to last slide there when you were looking at the forcing slide. Yes, that one. The validation has not been done in these regions. So how confident are you in the results?
I would say I am cautious until I can get some more validation. I mean, you know, the model does well compared to the data we have. Collecting data in those regions is not straightforward, and so, you know, I'm not going to make great claims from it now, but I'm at least reasonably pleased how it performs against the sites we have so far. And one of those has a temperature of -1, so, you know, these organisms are seeing pretty cold temperatures.
Super, thanks, Adrian. That was fascinating talk. So we'll move. I think Chelsey is back online. So if it's okay with you, Andrew, we'll move back to Chelsey so she can finish her final slides. And then if anyone has any questions for Chelsey. So are you there, Chelsey? Oh.
She was there a few minutes ago. She was certainly answering messages in the chat.
Yeah. Oh dear. Okay. Well, if she's not there, Andrew, we'll go to you. Sorry, I thought she was there. So let's roll to you, Andrew, and then we can come back.
Share my screen. Okay. Is that working for everyone?
I think it's just taking a second.
Looks okay at this end, but
yeah, I can see it okay.
Looks okay to me.
It's fine.
Go ahead. It's probably just taking an extra second on my machine. Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm talking about something related to both the previous talks. This is actually a talk I gave, albeit with a few additions, in Crescendo a few weeks ago. So apologies for those who've already seen something like it, but there is some new stuff in there as well. So I'm focusing again on this biological pump that Chelsey talked about, and how this is represented in CMIP6 models and how that has consequences for how they represent things in the future. So just to give a quick rehash, Chelsey's already covered some of this. The only thing I wanted to just sort of say is that the carbon cycle in the ocean is really controlled by two pumps. The biological pump is the one that's that Chelsey mentioned earlier. There's also the solubility pump. The solubility pump is actually doing most of the heavy lifting at this time with anthropous CO2. And that's largely because the biological pump is actually controlled not by CO2, but controlled by nutrients. So unless there's no more nutrients, you can't really change the biological pump. But the solubility pump does all this physical chemical stuff in the background. However, that's not always true. And into the future, we expect that changing temperatures will change the rates of biological processes. It will also change the stratification of the ocean vertically, and that will decrease nutrient supply. So for all these sorts of reasons, there may be, there's reasons to suspect that the biological pump strength will change into the future. Another thing about the biological pump, which separates it from the solubility pump, is it's not as well characterized. It deals with a large number of really complex ecological processes, most of which are very uncertain. So as a result, it's modeled extremely diversely in marine biogeochemical models. And this, again, has implications for how it's projected into the future. So for this work, we're looking at how the biological pump in the current generation of CMIP6 models has changed over the 21st century. I'm just sort of showing the bottom here, just a couple of pictures, just sort of show some of the things that are important for it. So mixed layer depth is on the top there. You're seeing on the left-hand side the historical, and the right-hand side just two scenarios. What you can see here is there's the little dots on the graphs show where there's agreement between the models. So the models say, yes, it's going to get deeper or shallower in these different regions. And you can start to see that's quite, the models agree very strongly. The bottom plot, by contrast, is primary production. So this is the driver for the biological pump ultimately. And you can sort of see there that although you can construct a mean behavior, there's a lot of disagreement in the models. And this is just the driver for the biological pump, let alone what happens subsequently. So the CMIP6 model I've used 6 of them at the moment, although I've got hold of some more subsequently. Most of these are from Crescendo. I've used the most extreme end member scenario, 585, just to get the largest effect. And what I've been doing is I've been comparing the sort of 2 decades of output, one from around about now and one from the end of the century. And I've just just listed here what the models are. One of the things really just to point out, the models are approximately 1 degree resolution, although the GFTL model is higher resolution, and there's obviously quite a range of both physical ocean, physical sea ice, and marine biogeochemical models, although there is some overlap between them, although when you actually look at the results, you wouldn't necessarily know that. So in terms of the way I'm going to do the analysis, I'm sort of dividing the ocean's processes into primary production, this export, what I'm calling export depth at 100 meters, and sequestration at 1,000 meters. Of course, Chelsey's already shown how ridiculous this way of dividing things up is, but you just have to bear with me. And what this is, and I'm just focusing on transfer material down from the surface. It's captured, DIC dissolved in organic carbon is captured through primary production into organic matter, and this is the thing that's transferred into the deep ocean where it's remineralized back to CO2. And I'm just in the left-hand side there, just sort of showing what UKSM is doing in terms of what it's doing for a DIC profile. So you can see at the moment we're not doing well. We have an offset, which is we've explored in the paper we published yesterday, but on the whole, that the pattern is not too bad. And of course, ultimately, physical processes return this DIC from the deep ocean back up to the surface where it can interact with the atmosphere again, which of course Chelsey also talked about. This is just a series of plots showing the present day primary reduction for the models that we looked at here. And you can sort of see the main thing is that there's lots of common features in the models, but there's also significant divergence in what the models suggest is happening in the real world in terms of primary production, particularly in the Southern Ocean. But there's also disagreement even in places which are low production, like the oligotrophic gyres. Some models, those are the kind of, you can look in the UKSM on the bottom right here, they're the very deep blue regions. Those regions are not quite as unproductive in other models. So there's some patterns of agreement, some patterns of disagreement. Now, if we switch instead to, this is export efficiency. This is the fraction of primary production that's leaving the upper ocean. And you can see straight away there's massive divergence in the models. I'm trying to express it here as a percentage of the amount of primary production. And you can sort of see that there are very few common patterns. EC Earth in the top in the middle here and IPSL in the bottom on the left, they share a biogeochemical model. So that's why they share in general patterns, but all the other models disagree. There is a kind of a general pattern that high latitudes have higher export efficiency than low latitudes, but even the MPI model reverses this. And if you look deeper in the water column, this is now 1,000 meters. This is what I'm calling sequestration. You can see again there's a divergence, further divergence in the models, and you can sort of see two of the models in particular, GFTL and MPI. They're sort of showing also the effects of these oxygen minimum zones on the pattern of remineralization in the water column. One thing to particularly note about UKSM is we are we don't like sequestration at all. So the UKSM, most of the production in the ocean is remineralized before it gets to 1,000 meters. We're a bit of an outlier on that point. And this is just a sort of summary, sort of showing the sort of transfer between primary production all the way through to export. And I've just shown here the actual fluxes in terms of grams of carbon, and then also the percentage as well. And a couple of things just sort of pull out, so on the whole, the models tend to agree around about what the production is. It's about 40 petagrams of carbon thereabouts. That's quite close to the observational estimates. And the observational estimates are very broad themselves, actually. This is not something which is easy to measure. Export production is very difficult to measure, and the people have all kinds of ideas about it, but it's not easy to do. And as you probably already gathered from the previous plots, the model becomes more and more uncertain. So if you look at, for example, the range of the ensemble compared to its mean, for primary production, that's only 20%. But by the time you get to the sequestration level, the models are 128% the mean. So that's a very broad range of sequestration in the models. As I mentioned already, it's difficult to validate this because it's difficult to measure export in the oceans. But however, what you can do is you can look at the other side of the equation, and export flux is turned back into something, and you can look at that something. And nutrients are one of the things we can use for this. This is just a kind of a very quick and dirty analysis. Sort of looking on the left-hand side, I've got a whole series of regions. The black plot is the observations, and the coloured lines are the various models. just to simplify this, on the right-hand side, I'm just sort of showing the kind of the mean bias for the models. And you can see there's some commonality in patterns there, but there's also a divergence, and UKSM is, I'm pleased to see, one of the divergers. UKSM has excess, so too much nutrient, which means too much remineralization in the upper water column, and not enough lower down. It has a reverse bias lower down, but the models are quite divergent on this point.
2 minutes.
So, thank you very much. So how does this compare to, export and sequestration efficiency? And unfortunately, this is where I've kind of bit unstuck actually. I can find no interesting patterns here at all. The models are very divergent. So we have there's no good relationship between the nutrient bias and whether you export a lot or sequester a lot. I'm still trying to get my head around this. These plots, these we've done quite recently, but they sort of they kind of are one of a piece with the uncertainty in this part of the model. Just jumping to the last part here. This is just to look at how these things change into the future. So I'll see. So the models disagree quite a lot in export and sequestration, but is that always the same? So they may disagree in the magnitude of things, but do the patterns of change into the future change? Are they sorry, is there a commonality or is there a difference? And there, at least, there's a bit more hopeful. There is some divergence in whether primary production goes up and down. About half the models said yes and half the models said no. But in terms of stuff getting into the ocean and getting deep into the ocean, the models are in general agreement that less material gets into the deep ocean, which is obviously bad news for Adrian's creatures on the seafloor. One thing to just point out, which is probably very important, is that the change in the sequestration, so the change of carbon getting to the deep ocean, is always very small compared to sea flux. So although this is maybe very exciting to people like myself, it may be less exciting to people who are interested in the wider global carbon system. Okay, so in summary, the models at least agree on primary production across the ensemble, but they differ in some patterns of spatial patterns and the biases. Export generally tracks the models primary production, but those things start coming out, the wheels start coming off at that point, and the models become increasingly more divergent. And when you look at efficiencies, the models are very divergent, and of which UKSM1 is a low sequestration outlier in the distribution I've looked at so far. I was hoping that nutrient distributions would tell us something about what was kind of going on there, and they would maybe help us understand which models were right, which models were wrong. But there's quite strong inconsistency there as well, where models can be high or low export and have high or low bias. There's no common patterns there. However, to go back to the last thing, in terms of the 21st century, while production is somewhat divergent in projection, the fate of the carbon being sequestered into the ocean is more common, and most models would suggest that it drops into the ocean. But as I said already, the absolute magnitude of change is small compared to the air sea flux, which is perhaps the thing most of us are more interested in. And I'll just stop here, but I'm just saying I'm preparing this as a manuscript at the moment. And I'm happy to have collaborators if anyone wants to join in. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Really interesting talk. There are a number of questions. My connection dropped a little bit towards the end there, so I've lost the chat, but I know Adrian had a question. Adrian, would you like to just ask your question verbally, please?
Yeah, it was just whether, instead of looking at nutrient concentrations at the top and the bottom, whether you've looked at the relationship between the nutrient gradient between top and bottom and sequestration efficiency.
I have not, but that would probably be a good thing to look at. I was hoping that nutrient bias alone would tell me something I want to know, but it doesn't. Another thing which occurred to me afterwards, as I should really have focused not so much on nutrients per se, but on the kind of new and regenerated nutrients. That might have helped as well. But your suggestion about the gradient is probably another one to look at as well, to try to tear a more sensible story out of the results I have at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, Rafa and myself did some work with the transport matrix, and we got a better relationship using the gradient.
Should have spoken to you then, shouldn't I?
Great, thank you. Colin's question was about the shallow remineralization depth in UKESM, and does that mean then that we underestimate the net carbon uptake?
That's a good question. I don't No, because when we evaluated the model's performance for the present day, the carbon uptake was kind of okay. We had about the right amount, and that's not a huge surprise because the solubility pump is doing most of the lifting. So as long as your circulation isn't nonsense, and as long as you've got a good temperature distribution in the ocean as well, that shouldn't be so bad. So no, so I'm not sure about that. It's something which I think I'll look at as well, as just to sort of see how divergent the models are, the CMIP6 models are in terms of the CO2 flux over that the period as well, just to sort of see if that tells us anything there too. But in principle, it's unclear whether that makes the model better or worse. There's a separate bias in UKSM which might be more important, and that is that we remove too much alkalinity from the surface ocean and transfer it into the ocean interior through the production of calcium carbonate. And what that means is the surface ocean is depleted in alkalinity, which means it has a lower basically buffering capacity for CO2. And that means that that we can store less CO2 in the upper ocean. Because the model was held during spin-up to constant PCO2 in the atmosphere, it came into equilibrium regardless. So even it didn't matter if the alkalinity was slightly too low, and that might be perhaps more of an issue going into the future, because, as I say, the buffering capacity of the ocean is not the same as it should be.
Okay, and just following up from that, then Peter asks, is there a systematic bias across the models now in nutrient distribution, specifically in the Atlantic?
Oh. There's not nothing systematic. The fact that across the biological models in CMIP6, there's very little that I would say was particularly systematic. There is a lot of diversity even in that property. I can't remember. I did look at that in the paper we got published because that was one of the things I compared across the CMIP6 ensemble. And some models do better than others. Our model in particular does badly in the Equatorial Pacific, in part due to iron stress in that region. I don't remember anything particular about the Atlantic.
Yeah, Andy, I just maybe I misread your diagram there showing the vertical profiles.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
It looked a bit like the models were outside the observations, all in the same direction in the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes, yeah, so you can sort of see, I see what you mean. Sorry, at depth, we seem to be, yeah,
depth,
that's right. Yeah. That's true. I don't know quite, I haven't looked at the detail of that. The one thing I would say, though, is that when I did look at the different regions, I did find that the model, you might think you've got a handle on what's going wrong with the models in one basin, but then you find that the models are disagreeing in some other way in another basin, which was kind of confusing. You might be right about that. The Atlantic in particular looks a bit more systematic, and the models are always a bit wrong. That could, of course, be a circulation problem as well. I'm presenting this as if it's all down to the biological pump, but of course circulation plays a role here too. And certainly some of the biases we see in UKSM for nutrients are driven by circulation issues.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Lots of interest there. Julie has a comment in the chat as well. In the interest of time, I'll let you respond to that in the chat if that's okay, because I do want to try and get back to Chelsey. We're going to call Chelsey again. Chelsey, come in if you're there. Third time lucky this time, Chelsey.
Yeah, I'm here this time. I'm so sorry, my internet literally died straight after you said my name last time.
Don't worry. Do you want to try and share your screen, and we'll go back to exactly that's where you were, and if you take it away, and we'll come back with some questions.
Oh, that's great, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. It's typical, isn't it? It picked it the best time to completely cut off. Okay, so I was moving on to say that what I've done is to estimate this carbon storage magnitude in petagrams of carbon per year for the 3 different sequestration horizon depths using the Medusa organic carbon fluxes. And so this would be the absolute magnitude of estimated carbon sequestration. But what I've then done is use this gridded sequestration efficiency to basically scale back these fluxes. So actually what could the potential storage be if we consider that, basically consider the circulation of these dissolved constituents. And so you can see that this really reduces the magnitude. I should say this is most likely to be a lower limit, as it one of the assumptions in the study is that the sinking carbon is kind of instantly remineralized at this depth, which isn't the case. But either way, it still gives confidence that these are probably overestimating, particularly at 500 meters. So what we can say from this is that using shallow carbon sequestrations overestimates the carbon sequestration magnitude, and that there's actually a very small amount of spread between these two, and that gives us an average North Atlantic carbon sequestration magnitude of 0.033 petagrams of carbon per year. So I'm still kind of working and thinking about this, but it's interesting at least. And then I had, just a very quick summary slide to say that the main 2 points from this work so far is that the depth of long-term carbon sequestration varies greatly by region within the North Atlantic. And so using these fixed horizons may lead to overestimates of long-term carbon storage. And some future work with this is to compare this to satellite-derived carbon fluxes, just to provide another estimate that's based on observations, and also to make some attempt, maybe rather ambitiously, to try and link sequestration efficiency to Eulerian properties, as this would, if it works, would allow application to lower resolution models. So that's me done. Thank you for letting me continue afterwards.
No problem, Chelsey, and thanks for a really interesting talk. Lee had a question. Lee, if you're there, do you want to just ask your question verbally?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for the talk. Yeah, I think you've sort of touched on it here at the end of the summary. I'm just going back. Yeah, so are the observational records that use a fixed horizon of 500 meters or 1,000, are they definitely overestimating the global carbon sequestering then?
So for the types of estimates, or observational estimates that have used, for example, 500 meters, so that's based on operation sediment trap data. So there's no, when they use those estimates, there's no accounting for any circulation or any of those kind of influences. And so my feeling is that 500 meters is very shallow to estimate for long-term carbon storage. And I think 1,000 meters really depends on the region. So yeah, I'm still kind of processing this and kind of working through it, but I think we just need to be careful when using these fixed horizons, that in some places it's just probably not the most appropriate sort of way to do it.
Super, thanks, Chelsey, and thank you for coming back and finishing off your talk. It's not easy when there's technical problems.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the speakers. We really interesting afternoon of talks. I've learned a lot anyway, which is really fascinating stuff, and very nicely presented. We are a little bit over time, but under time because we missed a talk. So I'm thinking that because we're at 14:22, Colin and Hazel, we should just move on to the close, and people will just have to wait for the paper in terms of UKCSM 1.1.
Yeah, I think that's kind of up to you, Jane. The close is going to take about 1 minute. So if you want to spend 5 or 6 minutes just going through the results you had to rush through, I don't think people will mind too much. But if you don't, if you think it's not time, then don't worry.
I can do it, but yeah, I'm not sure what I can do in 5 minutes. But what I can do is just show couple of the top level slides again, but it's kind of going to be rushing again, so I'm a little bit
I think you went through all the motivation and everything.
Sure,
it was
but
really the final results that were rushed.
Yeah, no, we can. Yeah, okay. Let me share my screen. I wasn't trying to get out of it or anything. I was just thinking people had a long afternoon. Okay, here we go. So yeah, we'll skip through all the motivation. We'll start with the top. So hopefully you can see that. So hopefully most of you then from yesterday. So I'll just talk about this for a couple of minutes because there are some nice results here. So hopefully you know, these are all familiar slides to you now from yesterday, but we went through them quite quickly. But really the top level and the main results from the UKCSM 1.1 historicals is this significant large improvement here in the global mean surface temperature anomaly. over the historical period. So we have a significant improvement in this large cold bias in UKSM1. And we can see that, looking at the top right here in the Northern Hemisphere exotropics, it's largely happening in this region in the Northern Hemisphere. So in many ways, you know, we've ticked the box of what we've set out to achieve, but as you know, a couple of people commented yesterday, of course, we haven't fixed everything in the model, so our climate sensitivity is still again the same. So it looks like we're still warming a little bit too much in this later period of the historical record. So you know, we haven't solved everything here, but we've kind of moved a little in the right direction to solve some of the biases. This is very nice. Look at the temperature trends, I thought, by Andrea Dittis. And again, just highlighting where spatially those temperature trends have changed in the model relative to UKSM1. So if you're looking at the period of that cold bias between the 1940s and 80s here in the middle row, you can see that 1.1 has higher warming trends here than previous. And this again is moving us in the right direction in terms of comparison against Hadcrit 4. So previously we were far, we had two large cooling trends in this period, but interestingly it shifts in the 80s to the 2014 period, and again I think this is because, as I'll show in the next slide, you know, obviously with changing aerosol emissions, you know, the implementation of air quality legislation led to large reductions of SO2 emissions during this period. For example, in the key emitter regions of Europe and the US at this time, meant that we're actually almost reversing the trends in this later period, which again, apart from, you know, this little bit of amplification going on in the polar region, which does potentially look interesting, but overall, again, it's going in the right direction in terms of reducing that the large warm bias that we had in the original model. So we're still warming too much. But we're moving again in the right direction. And so if you can see here, looking at the aerosol properties, so this is you know, the key drivers of the changes in the global mean surface temperature from what we can see in terms of our analysis so far. So the top row here is showing the global mean anomaly of a number of the aerosol and cloud properties, again with respect to this 1900 mean, and the bottom row, I'm just zooming in on that kind of northern hemisphere extratropical region, and note between the top row and the bottom row, you know, the scales are the vertical axes are different. So you can see again in terms of the UKSM 1.1 in red, so in terms of aerosol optical depth, the anomaly is much lower. So we have a lower increase in aerosol optical depth, and also in the middle plots here are showing cloud droplet number. So in this kind of region here, we see the reverse of the trends in the previous slide. You can see actually you know, where UKSM 1.1 was showing a significant kind of reduction in CDNC in this period. Actually, UKSM 1.1 is pretty flat. So the trends have changed here, and you know, when we are reducing, we're reducing from a lower, I guess, saturation point as such. And again, you can see the same again in the northern hemisphere extratropics. We have a much larger or much smaller increase, I should say. So the delta in cloud droplet number here is significant, and the same in terms of optical depth. So and this then feeds through to the cloud droplet effective radius, which then obviously feeds through to the aerosol indirect effects and in relation to the cloud albedo change. So so some very nice kind of clear results there, I would say. Another plot that I kind of quickly skipped over was just some evaluations. So obviously we want to evaluate, and so I showed yesterday obviously some of the SO2 evaluation that went into Catherine's paper, but here we want to bring in some of the other variables in terms of how things like aerosol optical depth and cloud droplet number are looking like in the model. And so UKSM1 here in the blue was always, and this came from my paper last year, where I looked at the full aerosol evaluation in UKSM1, and we were always a bit on the low side compared to this you know, group of different satellite observations here. And so we have you know, increased the optical depth here by roughly about 10% globally. if we look at the difference plot here in terms of spatially where these changes are happening, actually this is again interesting, because you can see actually that most of this increase is actually not this global mean increase is actually not coming from the SO2 changes, but it's coming from the dust tuning that we have employed. So we showed in UKSM1 here in the top right panel that the dust was looking visibly quite low in terms of the aerosol optical depth. So we took up the opportunity in UKSM 1.1 to retune that. So the dust is now in terms of optical depth is looking much better, but this does then dominate that global mean. But you can see signals of the SO2, particularly here over China, very nice effect, and here over the Northeast US, and if you look at the kind of comparison against some of the satellite data here, particularly over China, you can see a much more clear kind of spatial pattern emerging here, and the spatial change, I guess, in terms of over the China region is coming out a little bit more clearly. So that looks to be a lot better. I showed the ocean, which generally showed that again, in terms of the ocean heat uptake, the model is doing a lot better. This is a global top 700 meters, but you can also, Till has looked at this in terms of the ocean basins. And so you can see clearly this again is dominated in the North Atlantic. There's stronger ocean heat uptake again throughout the 20th century, similar signal in the North Pacific, but interestingly, the signal is reversed in the South Pacific here. So again, maybe something to dig into a little bit here, till it points to maybe some changes in the large-scale ocean circulation or background stratification. But from what we've looked at so far, and this is mainly done by Andrew Yool, most of the large-scale ocean circulation metrics are very similar. There is a systematic small reduction in the AMOC here that is, I think, to be expected given Matthew Menery's paper. So this would be consistent with the reduced aerosol forcing, I think. But looking at things like the Drake Passage, they are very similar and well within UKSM1's variability as well, I would say. And again, just to show this, obviously, again, to reiterate the improvements in the Arctic sea ice. And here in the right-hand side, which I probably glossed over yesterday, you can see the trends in UKSM 1.1, again, are in better agreement with the observations for the March and September sea ice extent than UKSM 1. And again, you can see a significant improvement in terms of the sea ice volume time series, although perhaps, again, the melt rate is looking a little bit too strong in the later period. Again, I've already highlighted, so I won't go into any more detail here because I'll wrap it up now. But again, things like the ECS, climate sensitivity is very similar. So as I said before, we haven't fixed everything. And finishing on the future projections again, which really early days in terms of the results here, and we're just unpicking this, but there does look to be a signal, despite the similar climate sensitivity, that the models are warming slightly less in UKSM 1.1 in the scenarios we've looked at. So that's it from there. I'll stop there, and if there's any burning questions, but we've probably run over time now as well. So I'll pass to you, Colin.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jane. There's one question in the chat from David that you can have a look at. Can you hear me okay?
Sharing.
Yeah. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Colin.
Okay, thanks. All right. Well, many thanks to all the speakers today. It was a really good selection of talks. I'll just take 2 minutes and then we'll be done. So going in reverse order, thanks to all the people that organised the breakout groups. Primarily thanks to Hazel for organising all the Zooms and sorting you all out and making sure that everything ran smoothly. So again, an electronic applause to Hazel, and many thanks for that. It's made, I think you've become an expert in running online meetings now, so your talents are going to be wanted everywhere. We managed to get through most things on time, I think, and fairly well. The only other things that we're going to say is we will try and summarise the breakout group discussions, and hopefully come up with a small list, I think, of papers for each of the different breakout groups, certainly for A, B, and C anyway. There seemed to be a list where people would put their name forward to lead, and I think if we can get 1 or 2 people to take a lead on them, then there'll be some momentum there. So if we can get 2 2 or 3 papers in each of those groups. I think that would be great. That'll be a great outcome. So we'll try with the breakout group leads to take that forward and then be in touch with everyone. Likewise, with the discussion we had about the 2 potential workshops, workshops that we will have, not potential, on impacts and policy, we'll try to collate the suggestions you had, use them, and then come back again with some questions about how we particularly go about with the impacts one, making something concrete out of suggestions that were there. And last point is the whole proceedings were recorded, and the slides as well. I think as long as the presenters are happy with it, then we'll make all the slides and the video available to everyone, and Hazel will be in touch with you about how and when that will occur. Have I missed anything out, or is that about it, Hazel, would you say?
I think that's about it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So with that, we're only 5 minutes over time, so that's pretty good. Thanks again to everyone for attending, and thanks for the presentations. And we'll be in touch verbally and electronically. Have a good afternoon.